I want to just first say, though, thank you to all the activists, First Nations folks who welcomed and showed solidarity to the folks of the Sunsea and the Ocean Lady when they came over. It was actually a really huge thing when we saw that in Toronto as a Tamil community. And I just want to share that thanks from the community from Toronto. This generosity from the First Nations has been replicated in Ontario as well by the Haudenosaunee Confederation, who have welcomed the Tamil community into the Turo Wampum, and we want to kind of represent that and here as well in the Coastal Salish Territories and all the other First Nations that are here. Yoo-hoo. Thank you. And it's heartfelt, and I get really emotional thinking about it because as my political career started as not very political. I wasn't a political creature as I entered university. As an immigrant, I was generally just a university student looking for a good job. I entered York University in 2006, and that's when we discovered something pretty tragic happening back home. Now, just kind of before going any further, how many people know what Eelam refers to? How many people know what Tamil tigers refers to? Okay, so there's a huge disparity. About like say 7 people know Eelam and about the whole room Tamil tigers. So, all right, and that's the problem right there. So I'm gonna touch on it right now. So this is a little introduction. The terrorist list effectively obscured the politics of legitimate and material reasons fueling movements. Instead, all attention is deferred to individual acts of violence or centralizes cycles of violence as the movement. It becomes about missiles being fired from Gaza rather than the fact that Gaza is under illegal siege and Gazans are at risk, Palestinians are at risk of ethnic cleansing from Israel. It becomes about First Nations roadblocks instead of the destruction of First Nations lands and livelihoods. It becomes about the Black Bloc breaking windows instead of about G20 austerity and poverty. And in my case, it became about the Tamil tigers instead of the fact that the Sri Lankan government was starving and killing thousands of my Tamil community members. And specifically, that included my own family. In 2006, I realized this as a part of a human rights campaign. And because we were Tamil and fighting for Tamil human rights, the Sri Lankan state labeled us as terrorists. That was my first running into that term. And as we tried to advocate among other communities and as well as like the political powers that be, through political parties such as the Liberals, the NDP, even the Conservatives, God knows why, we realized that we were tainted by this label of terrorism and that we had no choice. So we actually began researching the deeper concerns and reasons of why. And as a second generation Tamil here in Canada, I was born there, but I grew up here. I actually had no idea of the political consequences or ramifications. I knew the Tamil tigers, but I actually did not know what Tamil meant either. And this is actually a huge problem until 2007. And back to, and we're going to touch on that right now. Now, the principle of terrorism has so little definition in legal or political theory that it can be applied to almost anyone, and relying on colonial and racist undertones. It is often used the most to label indigenous and anti-colonial movements around the world as ignorant, savage, backwards, aberrant, and without political practice. The terrorism label is a tool to silence and criminalize dissent. It is as dangerous to Canadians as it is to everyone else. I especially refer to the 2010 G20 meeting in Toronto when peaceful anti-poverty and anti-austerity activists were rounded up in the hundreds in one of the largest illegal detention operations in all of Canadian history, excluding the largely unwritten history of land theft, enclosure, forced migration, and genocide that has continually been perpetrated against First Nations. After they were labeled terrorists, that was the reason hundreds, and many of these were my friends, and I'm sure some of you know them as well, as many of these activists were rounded up and arrested and detained for about 48 hours on the eve of G20. And I won't even mention how these actions, and sometimes those broken windows that were justified in calling them terrorists, were actually many times instigated by the police forces and security forces. Now, I'm going to actually go into the presentation I think is actually going to be much more clear, but I just want to introduce it really quickly, because I'm not going to go through everything, because within the 15-minute time frame. Primarily, I'm going to provide some of the oftentimes neglected context of the Tamil national liberation struggle as an example of a struggle that has been obfuscated by the terrorism label. Second, I'm also going to display the farcical application of the terrorism label by media, the Canadian state, and its reactionary allies. And third, to finally show how the terrorism label, by obscuring the root causes overemphasizing and delegitimizing certain forms of violent resistance is complicit with and even legitimizes even more horrific forms of violence. So just to be clear, this is actually the flag of Tamil Eelam. It was established by the Tamil Tigers to differentiate the national movement from their guerrilla movement. One of the things we realized by the time as our human rights kind of work was like winding up and realizing that this wasn't just about human rights, this was actually a political problem. And then we started looking at different political issues. One of the options was Tamil Eelam as a nation needs to be represented and recognition as an option. And it was the one that a lot of folks, after looking at the history, the material reasons, and the context of Sri Lanka, a lot of folks in the community came around to, including us. Now, if you guys don't know where Tamil Eelam is, it's what is now called Sri Lanka in the north and east, the green part's right there. So some geographic idea. Some facts about Tamil Eelam really quickly. It's descended from a medieval, geographically from a medieval kingdom called in colonial English, Jaffna Kingdom, administered separately from Sinhalese kingdoms by the original Portuguese and Dutch colonial authorities because of linguistic, cultural, religious, geographic, and economic differences. As many other movements such as Palestine, indigenous movements here in North America, Turtle Island, as well as around the world, a lot of the problems can actually be linked to this one moment, the beginning of British colonialism. After the Sinhalese were able to capture the whole island from the Dutch, they administratively united the Tamil Kingdom, Jaffna, with the two other Sinhalese kingdoms in 1833 and named it the colony of Ceylon. And this remained as such until the independence of Ceylon in 1948. And that's exactly when the problems started happening. In 1948, the Ceylon Citizenship Act disenfranchised 1 million Tamils that had lived there for about 4 to 5 generations, so they were left without any rights and basically as slaves. 1956, the Sinhala Only Act. Now, Sinhala is the other language, the majoritarian language on the island, was made the only language of Sri Lanka, and removed Tamil as an official language. In 1970, the Standardization Act, which restricted Tamil university students from entering universities, and the Republican Constitution renamed Ceylon to Sri Lanka, as it is now, in 1972. And this was adopted without Tamil participation, and in 1972, Buddhism was accepted as the state religion of Sri Lanka. Tamils are mostly Muslim, as well as a majority are Hindu, with significant minorities of Muslim and Christian communities. Now, this is the important part. Now, when all those things were happening, the Tamils weren't actually being idle. And I actually did this on purpose because I had no way of covering all the non-violent acts in time for 15 minutes. So if you want, you can go on Wikipedia and read it all. So like we're talking about 60 years of non-violent political activity as each of those legal jurisdiction passed. Now, the center man right here, his name is Mr. Thande Chavanayagam, is seen participating in the Satyagraha movement. He's basically, in the Tamil community, he's actually revered. He's a cross between Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi, with one big exception. He failed. And here's the reason why. Every time that there was movements created in response to laws, the Sri Lankan state, because of its majoritarian basis, was able to use violence to deflect any kind of political progress. These are just some of the many race-based ethnic riots that happened targeting Tamils. 1956, 1958, 1977, 1981 is a very significant one. The Jaffna Library was the Tamil equivalent of the Smithsonian. About 2,000 to 3,000 years of history that was lost by the burning. I'll read it. This riot involved the destruction of the Jaffna Public Library. With the loss of over 100,000 books, artifacts, and palm writings, many irreplaceable historical documents and artifacts of Tamil civilization were lost forever. Some police and army members were accused of collusion in the riots. 4 Tamils were killed. And I think many communities here, such as the Palestinians, First Nations, they know how this works. The destruction of a people's history is the first step in destroying the people. And then the much more infamous 1983 riots, where about 3,000 Tamils were killed as the Civil War started in earnest. Now, all this led to a progression. It was called the Vattikotta Resolution. The Vattikotta Resolution was adopted on May 14, 1976, in Panakam near Vadukere, Northern Province, Sri Lanka, called for the creation of an independent Tamil Eelam by the Tamil United Liberation Front under the leadership of SGV Chavanayagam. 1977, on its demand for Tamil Eelam, the TULF won an overwhelming mandate in the Tamil areas. We're talking about 90% participation and 90% vote yes for separatism, and became the only time a minority party has became the official opposition in Sri Lanka on this platform of separatism. It gave impetus to Tamil nationalists who claimed it was a democratic endorsement in favor of a separate state. Now, the TULF demand for Tamil Eelam nets the Sri Lankan government to pass the 6th Amendment to the Constitution, which made it illegal to politically advocate for separatism. The TULF resigned at the time as Tamil militancy was on the rise because they had to either join the parliament as an official opposition but ignore the democratic mandate of the people, or resign, which they did, which subsequently left Tamil militants led by groups like Plot and LTTE and a whole bunch of other militant groups. The LTTE is the official name of what is called the Tamil Tigers, over the leadership of the Tamil political struggle as all peaceful avenues were finally closed. Now, in part of this, in Sri Lanka, the Prevention of Terrorism Act of 1978 is a law in Sri Lanka. It provides the police with broad powers to search, arrest, and detain suspects. It was first enacted as a temporary law in 1979 and made permanent in 1982. Under the Section 9 of the PTA, people can be arrested in the absence of formal charges filed against them and can be detained for up to 18 months without trial or charge. And now with the emergency laws, if you actually die in detention, which happens a lot, they can actually bury you in an unknown grave without informing your family. And many communities here have experience of that as well. Just to give you an idea, these are actually the list of like the major militant and minor militant groups that rose after the passing of those laws. My little thing got changed, but actually the list goes on for about another 30 more after this. So just to give you an idea, so it's obviously everything's been tied into the LTTE. So the question is so all these other movements have different political strikes, some more progressive, some more reactionary, but everything is all about the LTTE. Now, the LTTE over time did become the sole major group by either fighting other groups, absorbing them, or other groups just straight out selling out to the Sri Lankan state. Now, some quick information about the LTTE. It was first established in 1972 as a small group and then reestablished as a guerrilla army in 1976, around the time of the Vatikota Resolution. 2009 had approximately 10,000 cadres organized into a political wing, a military wing, and a civil society groups under them. They had a full military brigades, naval units, air wing, the only such movement to do so, and suicide commando units. Known to use suicide bombings, assassinations, as well as regular joint force military assaults against important political, military, economic, and civilian targets. This is the actual LTTE. This is what they look like. Now I'm going to go in really quickly in what has been labeled as LTTE supporters or LTTE people next. And this is the listing, and I'm just going to, they were listed in 2006, and it was actually very important, and you touched on it. It was 2006, there was a peace process where the LTTE was actually making pretty strong progress. And what happened during this time is that in Canada and in the EU, the LTTE was labeled as a terrorist, changing the balance so the diaspora couldn't support them, changing the balance and giving the Sri Lankan government the go-ahead for an all-out assault. So really quickly, now who are terrorists? Is every Tamil a terrorist? So these are the terrorists that Sri Lanka detained right after 2009, about 350,000 of them. I don't know if you can see the picture. Really dangerous terrorists. Some more terrorists. You actually see the guard. He needs that AK. He's terrified of them. And once again, the MV Sunsi. These were people that were detained, illegally detained, because they were a security threat to Canada. More terrorists. This is the protest in Toronto. This is a child that's holding the Tamil Eelam flag. If you actually go to the articles that have these pictures, they were called terrorists. Here's more terrorists. And sometimes, just to give you a support idea, and this is a question that keeps being debated, right? The Tamil Tigers forced 30,000 people, the largest protest in Toronto, to take over the streets, waving the Tamil Eelam flag. This is the kind of logic that comes up. There's actually wide popular support because of the history I just kind of really quickly went over, and a lot of, my parents actually lived through the violence. I was actually born in the 1983 riots. My mom tells me the story about how her neighbor was dragged out, had tires put on him, and then burnt alive in front of their house. And this is some more of those groups. These are terrorists. These are all several generations of Tamils protesting in Toronto. More terrorists on the Gardiner. When we occupied the Gardiner, the first time that was ever done in Toronto. Remember that? Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, who looks more terrifying? You got to be honest, right? And we took it all the way to Parliament. We're like, you know what? It was a moment of desperation. Now, ironically, the Canadian Conservative MP Deepak Oberoi was actually called a terrorist by the Sri Lankan state because during yesterday he put this little. He's trying to buy votes, but whatever. Saying, and it says, in memory of all Sri Lankans killed in the war, and that qualifies him to be a terrorist in Sri Lankan eyes. To give you an idea. This is myself. We were actually at an interesting story. Solidarity, as our political knowledge was growing, and Six Nations invited us. I was actually called a terrorist by neo-Nazis who were trying to organize lynch mobs against indigenous communities in Caledonia. And I wore a shirt to show the Tamil communities support back to the community. So some really quick. Now, who are not terrorists and what is acceptable in this regime? So this is an IDP camp. And this is the first picture. That's the camp, and that's the camp after the Sri Lankan army bombed it. There's about 400,000 people crowded into that area. This is what it looks in real time. Internally displaced peoples. Those were basically all the Tamils that were forced out of their areas. This is what the area looks like, and this is the Sri Lankan soldier. This is not a terrorist, just to be clear here. This is okay under the current regime. So as I said, we were actually protesting against the blockage of food, water, and medicine. This is what the Sri Lankan army was going for. It's classic counter-insurgency plan. Starve the people that support the tigers, and you beat the tigers. Well, that's the people that support the tigers. And here in the filing, this is not terrorism. This is the 12-year-old son of the leader of the Tamil Tigers. He was caught alive by the Sri Lankan army, photographed, and then he was executed. He was a terrorist, but what they did to him was not terrorism. And these are actually from trophy videos taken by the Sri Lankan soldiers. So I'm almost done. I gotcha. Now, unfortunately, there's more pictures and video that has emerged of Sri Lankan atrocities against Tamils. It is graphic and shows systematic rape, mass executions, and bombardment. The videos were taken as trophy videos by Sri Lankan soldiers. I don't have the heart to show them. I've showed them before, and I've had people cry, the majority of people cry, and including myself. Here, but if you wish to see it with your own eyes, these are available online. They've been made by two excellent documentaries have been made. Sri Lanka's Killing Fields and The No Fire Zone are available by Channel 4. You can YouTube or Google them. If you want to see them, you can talk to me later. So really quickly, a final note on the strategic and political use of the terrorism label. As I noted in the slideshow, the LTTE was only listed in Canada in 2006, and this is significant. By 2006, the Sri Lankan state had been stalemated politically and militarily by the LTTE, and the wide political support it had garnered for national liberation amongst the Tamil diaspora. As I showed you in those videos of all those Tamils protesting in Toronto, those were 30,000 people. The whole G20 protest only brought out 30,000 people. So one community brought out that many people. At this time, negotiations were in progress to establish a political solution, a success that was unacceptable to the West and imperialists, as this would inspire other popular resistance movements to try their own political breakthroughs. The terrorism label was specifically meant to cut off the LTTE from the wider popular support Eelam national liberation had in the Tamil diaspora, something that some sections still wish to deny, even after thousands of Tamil community members took over the streets in Toronto, waving the Eelam flag. The terrorism label either silenced activists or politically marginalized activists who wanted to represent the popular support of the Tamil community for national liberation by labeling them as terrorist sympathizers. You can imagine the consequences on working class immigrants. This shutdown or marginalization of political advocacy that could have prevented the Sri Lankan state from committing on all those massacres that killed 150,000 Tamils in 2009. But it is also the signal that the Sri Lankan state had the full consent and go-ahead from the West to commit a total war policy, complete wipeout, no matter the cost of the Tamil people, which, as I said, 150,000 people died, and untold misery. If the cost of failure is so high, then how can we demand movements to limit the resistance and retaliation? A great deal of the responsibility lies with us to prevent the kind of imperialist aggression and suppression that leads to movements to rely on desperate acts of resistance in the first place, as they know imperialist powers are committed to onslaught and complete destruction of their whole nations. I tried to finish really fast there. I hope that I get the point out. If you have questions, please ask. I basically gave you guys about 100 years of history plus some political theory.